Hi, guys. Before we get to this episode of Needlessly Complicated Chaos, I just want to head this one up with a trigger warning. The following episode can contain some intense subjects, and they may not be comfortable for all audiences. Listener discretion advised. Check the trigger warnings in the show notes. Welcome to Needlessly Complicated Chaos. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Needlessly Complicated Chaos, the podcast that is exactly what it says on the tin, a little bit complicated, a lot of bit chaos. So, I am one of your lovely hosts. My name is Ace, my pronouns are he, him, and I am joined by...
My name is Lynn. My pronouns are she, her.
And I am Sky. My pronouns are she, they.
And today, my friends, we are talking about fandoms and nerd culture as a whole. The communities and the juicy, juicy big boys that have got us into nerddom as a whole. So today, I know that we have something a little bit different, but a lot exciting. We've got a guest coming on in the later half of our episode to talk to us about what fandom means to them and to kind of get a little fresh perspective from other little nerdlings like ourselves. So, starting us off, what are some fandoms that you guys are personally a part of, or that you find are part of the big few, if you will?
Well, personally, I was forced to like Star Wars by a lovely guest that we're gonna see later.
Star Wars is the bee's knees, my guy. Love
No,
Star
I
Wars.
like it. It's just that I was forced to like it. Just like forcibly watched
So
it.
you're gonna watch it and you're gonna like it. But yeah, Star Wars is definitely one of the big boys. Lynn, what's one of the big ones that you are a fan of? You find?
Well, we've talked a bit more about this in depth in one of our previous episodes, but definitely Harry Potter,
Oh
one
yeah,
of the big boys
one of the
that I
big kids on the
subscribe.
block.
Mm-hmm. But I'll be honest, I know very little of Star Wars.
Star Wars is my one
It's a
true
beast.
love. No, my one true love
It
is
is not
Subway.
that I dislike it. I simply never got into it. That's all. But okay, so as said, it's not that I dislike Star Wars. It's just that I don't know it well enough. I enjoy what I understand,
What I'm hearing from you,
but
Lynn, is that we need to watch all 24 hours of the original Star Wars so that you
Plus
can
Clone
understand it.
Wars and Rebel.
Well,
Plus the Mandalorian.
now we're
Plus
way
the Book of
outside of
Boba
24
Fett.
hours.
so next
But
time
We're
yes,
gonna
you hear
kidnap
from
Lynn
me,
person.
I will then be a Star Wars expert,
yeah,
apparently.
yes.
One of the other ones that I really enjoyed was Game of Thrones, but
Oh,
to be fair, it's I'm not as in depth as Ace.
that's my one true love, Game of
So
Thrones.
so says the guy who just said that Star Wars is his one true love.
Okay, to be fair, I said Star Wars is my one true love, and then I immediately amended that to Subway sandwiches. So, and while I stick with that Subway sandwiches are my one true love, in terms of media, it's definitely Star Wars and Thrones. I'm literally staring right now. I can't turn my camera because I'll ruin my entire setup. But I have a giant Ewan McGregor Obi-Wan right in front of me. So, for inspiration.
For the people not watching on our YouTube, you can always see our lovely faces there.
This is true, and in the YouTube, I will flash up a picture so you can see our Lord and Savior Ewan McGregor's face.
Apparently, all of our Lord and Savior.
Yes,
Yes.
he did not have to go that hard, but he did that. He did that for us. I'm also gonna flash up my Obi-Wan shelf that I have right beside me there. Oh, I realize that looks like I'm pointing to my Power Rangers, but it's out of frame. I digress. So yeah, Power Rangers, that's another one of the big boy fandoms, and that reminds me of superheroes. So we got our DCs, our Marvels, Thrones, Harry Potter, Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, all the very popular big fandoms that people really get into. I do think that there are those overly powerful popular boys on the street, and those are definitely like some of the ones that we mentioned there are the big ones. So in
Yeah,
terms
they're
of
usually the first one that we get into, right?
yeah,
Like the first time that we interact with that nerd fandom really is when we talk about the big boys.
oh yeah, it's our
They're easy to start from.
gateway
Yeah.
fandom, if you will. So, for you, what was your gateway fandom, guys?
I would definitely have to say Harry Potter. I know it's a cliche one, but it is the first thing that I started with that really got me into the fantasy. Because from Harry Potter, basically all I read were fantasy books. It then expanded into further nerd culture things. Comic books, superheroes. Not like, I'm not super into comic books, but I enjoy like the superhero stories.
Yeah.
Later on in life, I really got into Game of Thrones, the series. I admittedly have not read the books, but
I'll fix that.
But I enjoyed the TV series a lot. But yeah, it was definitely Harry Potter that started it for me.
The quintessential millennial experience, Harry Potter.
Mm-hmm.
What was your Sky?
I don't really have one. Like, I experience all of the fandom and I enjoy all of them,
Mm.
but I was not part of like that big moment until I got a group of friends that were.
Ah.
Mm.
So you
And
were
that
just
was
like
really.
pure, distilled nerd from the jump, just waiting for other little nerdlings to come to your
I
general
was like,
location.
where are my nerds? Have no nerds over here. I
Send
have to
signal.
move.
Yeah, to be fair, yes, absolutely. It does result in I need to move. I can't be in this environment without the nerds. Let's see, for me, I think it probably I think it was more of an obscure thing for me. I had a little bit of a hop, skip, and a jump into nerddom because for me, when I was a little kid, and I mean a little kid, like I was like, man, I sure do love horror movies. I sure do love that shit. And horror movie culture does have that nerdy flavor to it. And, like, I remember being 4 years old, I definitely shouldn't have watched this movie. And, like, when I was little, I would watch things like, like the Scooby-Doo and all this stuff. Your gateway spooky kid shows, like, age-appropriate shit. And then I remember they had rented. You remember back in the day? We're gonna sound really old now. Remember back in the day when you could like rent a bunch of VHSs all at once?
Yeah.
Back in
Yeah,
our day.
like the most that you rented, the less expensive that it was.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, back in
yeah.
those, and the video store
There's
near
also like
us.
days where like if you go specifically or on like a day like
Oh,
I think it was
Tuesdays.
Tuesdays or Wednesdays.
Yeah.
Tuesdays usually it was like a discounted rent.
Circling back, yeah, it was back in the old timey times when I was a wee babby in the 90s. So they had like the 7 VHSs and they were all stacked beside the VCR. And I was a particularly tall baby. Too bad I never became a tall adult. But I was a particularly tall baby. So I was like I was watching A Bug's Life. I remember this because I broke the thing. Oh, wait, no. Sorry. It wasn't A Bug's Life. This was before A Bug's Life because this would have been like 1997, so it was Toy Story. So I was taking out Toy Story, and that's actually why I was able to break Bug's Life later on because Mom made the mistake. She made the mistake of showing me how to take the thing out of the VCR when I was done rewinding it so I could put a new cassette in, which would later cause me to break A Bug's Life and Mom's VCR at once. And then I was no longer allowed to touch it until I was an adult. Like, I was taking out Toy Story, and they had the stack of movies, and I was like, oh, RoboCop. That sounds cool. There's a robot man on this VHS cassette, and I like robots. Robots are cool.
Robot that's a cop.
So I fucking hate cops. I like robots.
Oh.
I picked it up, and I was like, dope! And I put it in. I mean, I didn't say that because I was fucking 4. I was probably like, woo! And I just stuck that in the VCR. And then, I remember my parents came back out of their room, because I think they were changed. Oh, I remember. They used to have a waterbed. They were filling the waterbed. And they came back out of their room, expecting to see me sitting there, bobbing along to the credits of Toy Story for the 45th time in a row. And I'm just watching RoboCop. And my mom's like, what the fuck are you doing? And I was like, Mom, this guy's a fucking robot. I did not say it that way, but I was just like, this guy's a fucking robot. This is the coolest shit I've ever seen. And my mom's like, shit. This is an R-rated movie. You're like 20 minutes in. God damn it. But yeah, and then after that, I was just like, oh, I want to see like more horror and sci-fi stuff. And my mom was like, are you well? And then I was like, yeah, no, I like this stuff. And I mean, like, I'm a well-adjusted human being, surprisingly. But,
Are you?
I mean, yes. Very weirdly enough, yes. By all means, I shouldn't be.
For all the trauma, yes.
Yeah,
All the trauma.
legit.
That is as normal as you can get with all that trauma.
Very, very true. But yeah, I remember RoboCop was like the thing that I was like, oh, I should check into these things. And then I remember when we were all very small, Tim Burton Batmans were happening. And
Ah, yes,
I
yes.
remember that whole promotion where they had like the McDonald's. They didn't have the toys, weirdly enough, but they had like those
The
glass
cup.
mugs,
Yeah.
yeah,
Mm.
and the cups. And I was like, "Mom, I want to see Batman." And she was like, "Oh yeah, sure, that is something you may watch. We can do Batman." So then DC was really my entry point into fandom because I was just like, "Oh my god, this is so cool." And little kid me, wow, this has got to be indicative of the red flags all over this, but I was just like, Batman's lame. I love the Riddler. And Mom's like, why are you like this?
What have I wrought?
And so what have I done? I was like, oh, I really like these things. And Mom's like, well, there are other superheroes. Well, look at these. And I was like, yeah, those are cool, but they're not spooky enough for me. And then Mom was like, well, you liked RoboCop, so what about Star Wars? And I was like, alright, what's a Star Wars? And she's like, they have laser swords. I'm like, shit, I'm in. So it's a toss up for me because I did like nerdy stuff. Superheroes, I guess, is technically the entry point, but what really did it was that Star Wars thing. Then I was like, well, I'm hooked. I guess I'm a Jedi, Mom. It's what it is. And she's like, oh, thank God, finally, not the villain. Finally.
Which is like the entry for most people. When I think about my son, that's the thing that he's into, except for Power Rangers, of course. But
The almighty
Ah,
Power
Power
Rangers.
Rangers. That's also a big one. That was the big one in the 90s.
well, what is
Points
funny
at
about
Power
him is
Rangers shelf.
what is funny about the Power Ranger and my son is he watch all of them, but at the same time, it still makes sense in his brain. But for me, I'm completely fucking lost.
Oh my god, when I was showing my nephew Power Rangers, because he's like, oh, what do you like right now, Uncle Ace? And I was like, well, I really like Power Rangers. We started watching Power Rangers, and he just like turns to Katie and his mother, and he's just like, I love Power Rangers, Mom. She's like, yeah, I thought you would. So I thought so.
Also, who doesn't want to be the red Power Ranger? He's the leader.
Justin,
Yeah, that's
Justin
true.
doesn't want to be the red one anymore. He wants to be the blue one.
I mean,
Oh.
blue is always your loyalty right hand man, tech support. He is the
That's
guy.
true.
So blue is clutch. Also, my nephew James has moved over from red. He's no longer interested in red. His favorite color is orange now, and there's not an orange Power Ranger, so
Ah,
he's
well.
disenfranchised with the entire thing.
The one for every color of the rainbow.
He's like, it'd be better if there was an orange one. And I'm like, well, sometimes the Sixth Ranger is orange. And he's like, yeah, but that's too many episodes. And I was like, yeah, that's fair.
No, if you
He
think
does the
about
same
it,
thing as your son, like watching all of the different Rangers at once.
Oh,
And I'm like,
yeah.
what are you getting from this? There's,
I
I
don't
don't understand
know.
what's happening right now.
When they're trying to explain it to you, and it makes no fucking sense if you're trying to explain it, an episode of Power Rangers, by the way. So imagine like a 5-year-old trying to explain it to you.
Well,
it makes no sense now.
to be fair, like a crazy person, I watched all 35 years of Power Rangers, back to back.
Yes, you did mention. Briefly.
I did. Quarantine hit, and I was like, well,
There's nothing
guess
else
I'll
to
watch
do.
35 years of Power Rangers, and then I did. It's not like they connect, and then I watched the first 3, and I'm like, oh god, every season actually is connected. And then I started getting further in, I'm like, well, I can't stop now. And I get like 15 years in, and I'm like, there's so much Power Rangers, and I fucking love Power Rangers, but I'm still like, this is a lot. And not every season, like, not every set of Power Rangers is good. So I'm just like, oh god, I've done this now. And then somewhere around year 25-ish, I was like, what have I... Ooh, I've just hit 2010. Oh god, it's still have 10 years of this. But I did it, and I must say, in terms of nerd culture, I think no other franchise that I know of was brave enough to take 30 fucking years of lore and carry it across.
Yeah.
Because while
That is
Power
a feat.
Rangers isn't like hyper serious, it is much more lighthearted. Some seasons really do get into like the technical side of things, like they explain the morphing grid and they explain the superheroes, but like they explain it and you have to actually watch all 35 years to get it.
So many of our things that we watch, like the first season, they have absolutely no budget. Flying by the see their pants and like, eesh, like
Oh, looking at you, Buffy.
looking at you, Buffy.
Buffy is another big touchstone of nerd culture, also feminist icon Buffy.
Oh
right
yeah.
there. Which kind of brings us into the whole idea of toxicity of fandoms. And I feel like there is that issue where there's not always the needed representation in the big boy fandoms.
Mm,
Because
definitely.
while your DCs and your Marvels are quick to give you female superheroes, they're also really quick to either hypersexualize or depower them. And then,
Or even worse, fridge them.
oof, that's literally where the term came from, Green Lantern.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know.
Admittedly, there are certain things that we can talk even further at length at this later on, but in terms of showing representation, there are certain things that, depending on the time, depending on who writes it, they can only go so far,
Mm,
which we should try and, give them a bit of the benefit of the doubt. But there are definitely times where it's just like, okay, yeah, no, you should not have done that, such as, fridging the
yeah.
poor
Oh my
girl, and,
god. That
ugh,
was terrible.
it's
And
just bad.
that is true. I do think there is a lot of what people forget is like, yeah, sometimes that was from a time that things were fucky, and holding it to today's standards, it's not going to hold
It's not
up.
going to gel.
So, like, there are times where you're like, this was never okay, then or now, why'd you do this? But there are other things where you're like, okay, well, that wasn't okay, but does the modern day version of this have it? No? Okay, well, then good. There
Mm-hmm.
was that whole team up moment in the end of Endgame. There was a whole all girls superhero moment. And that's
Yeah.
huge because go back maybe 10 years, there wouldn't have been that.
No.
That there was enough named, well developed power sets, clearly identified female characters, and have a huge power move, and then the whole having Captain Marvel be strong enough to literally punch Thanos in the face, where you're seeing Captain America and Tony get their ass beat.
Yeah.
Like that was big. So it
Yeah.
does show that we are going in the right direction, however
It
slowly.
yeah, it's slowly and it's not done like it's not done correctly at all, but like they're trying.
It's
Like
there.
point for trying. Yay.
And
But
like
that's it.
but that's it. You get the try and nothing else.
Participation award.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it is true. It is good to see because I do think that that's something people always forget in fandom is that people of color and women and the gays, we've always been here. We've always been the writers and the fans and the consumers of this content. It's not new that we're part of this world, but it is newer that we're getting seen or identified or any kind of representation. I think now with them being a lot bolder, like say, I know this was particularly not a choice that sat well with everybody, but like going with Jason Momoa for Aquaman, well, bringing him back to Polynesian Islander roots feels more realistic than having a blonde haired, blue eyed white guy come from an ocean place. You know, it
Meh.
didn't really make sense. They made it make sense. And am I the biggest fan of Momoa or the change itself? No, because I actually do genuinely like Aquaman, like a fucking weirdo, because most people don't. But I actually do. I like him. I think he has character. But I did like that they did that, and I think other in-world changes like that are important. And now we're also seeing more characters who are genuinely people of color be used. I know we're supposed to be getting a Blue Beetle thing, and as a Mexican, seeing Jaime Reyes, a tiny little Mexican boy, get to be in the thing, that's a big deal for me, you know? And now you're also seeing strong female lead things. We're getting, in Marvel, we're getting the Miss Marvel TV series, and that's going to be Camilla
Oh.
Khan. So
Mhm.
you're getting a Middle Eastern superhero female
Which actually, if you
lead.
think about it, in Western media, there's very little. Like, if you think about it specifically for Muslim characters,
Hmm.
there's very, very, very little.
It's the whole uncomfortable racism that
Mm.
is the current. So I think the fact that this is being made and it's being made at
It's
one of
amazing.
it's being made by fucking Disney, the kings of we aren't going to do anything, that's huge for a
Yeah,
heavily
it is.
conservative company to be like, you know what? No, we are going to do these female led productions. We are going to start using people of color. We're even going to slowly give you the gays real slow because we're still run by conservatives, but we're doing it, and that's
We're
something.
sprinkling them here and there a bit more now.
You get the little nods of them. So it's starting. The representation is slowly rolling in. And with that said, of things slowly rolling in, we're going to slowly roll out of the first half of this episode and slowly roll in to our guest spot. So we'll take a short break and we'll catch you guys back up with our guest. And welcome back, everybody. So now we have a guest for y'all. Our first guest, we are going to talk a little bit more about what fandom culture means to another fellow nerd. Please welcome our guest, Frank.
Hello. Thank you for being here.
All right, thanks for having me, y'all.
Frank, thank you for coming. And what are some of your favorite fandoms, some big fandoms that got you into nerddom?
Honestly, the list is probably shorter to say which ones are not on the list. But I mean, let's just go with the major ones: Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Marvel, DC. There's some others. The major ones. Initially, there was also some like anime and all that type of stuff, but that's kind of taken a back end. But yeah, Star Wars, video games, all that good stuff.
The big
boys.
boys. What would you say, like, draws you to a fandom, per se? What gets you invested in a story?
Well, The Lord of the Rings was when I was 4 years old. It's the first book that my dad read me was The Hobbit. It was our bedtime story.
Wow.
So
That's
it was
a
just
cultured bedtime story. Holy shit.
yeah. So that's what maybe I was older than 4, but like I just remember it like I was super young and like he would read me The Hobbit, and that was like kind of our going to bed story, and that was kind of our routine, and that kind of set me into like this fantasy world like that's spiraled into like Terry Brooks or like other authors like that, or the Dragonlance series as well with Raistlin and Karamis and all those good folks. My dad was a huge Star Trek fan, so we watched Star Trek together. Eventually, I discovered Star Wars with him as well, and I discovered I like Star Wars a little bit more than Star Trek, but I still like Star Trek, but which is rare in terms of fandoms because normally you like one and you don't like the other.
That's
But
true. You usually get that DC versus Marvel vibe with
yeah.
Star Trek and Star Wars. You either like one or you like the other kind of thing.
For
And
someone
Which
that
is
doesn't know much about Star Trek, why is that? Like, why is there like that love of one or the other, not but not both?
so I would say Star Trek kind of focuses more on we're humanity's last hope, where versus Star Wars, which is it's not just humans versus the rest of the planet. It's an entire universe that's being built, and you can choose to give your attention where you want to. Versus Star Trek, it's focused on one adventure, and this is who you're following, and you're invested in the characters.
Yeah, like I
Mm.
would say that's definitely how it is story wise. Like you really do get that Star Wars has got the scope and Star Trek feels very focused, but also I just think genre wise, everybody's so quick to lump them both in as just, oh, these are sci-fi. And yeah, they definitely are sci-fi properties, the biggest two no doubt, but one feels very politics because Star Wars, like it or not, is extremely politics. It's the
Oh, yes.
Trade Federation
Oh, yeah.
and it's the consequences of war and the horrors of it and all that kind of stuff. It's weighty. Whereas Star Trek, it's about the human experience. It's about like boldly going. It's about like being the most human you can be and hyper fixated on individualism, not a greater good or greater consequence kind of thing. So I feel like depending on what flavor you like, or if you just aren't a fucking fan of politics, you're gonna lean one way or the other.
So you could argue that Star Wars is more plot driven, whereas Star Trek is more character driven.
I would argue that neither of them are
I
particularly good at either of those things. Actually,
yeah.
I think theoretically, yes, but in practice, absolutely not.
Okay.
It also depends which Star Wars you're talking about too. If it's
Yeah.
the original trilogy, which was really let's focus less on the characters and like here's a bad guy, here's a good guy. Let's give no backstory to either of them.
Yeah.
He's the bad guy, he's the good guy. But this is the universe that we're building, and they're just two people within that universe. Whereas
Okay.
Star Trek, like you know where Data comes from, you know where Captain Picard comes from, you know where they all come from.
But Star Wars hot take, and I know this is going to be a hot take, but this original trilogy is not the best Star Wars at all. It's not. And like I love the original trilogy and I get why it makes everybody like so fucking excited and all that shit, but I would really argue that Star Wars, while its main story from like 1 to 9, it makes sense. It's weird, but it makes sense. I think the side stories are actually always significantly stronger. Like shit like The Mandalorian, Clone Wars, all that stuff is so much more tight than anything else. I know the big arguing point for most Star Wars fans is, oh, original trilogy and nothing else. But, like, to do that is a huge disservice to an otherwise really brilliant franchise.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
And to the people that would say original trilogy, nothing else, like everything else is not Star Wars, that's a toxic fandom.
yeah.
Bottom line. I was listening to someone talk about it, and when he was explaining his experience of he went to go see the Phantom Menace,
Mm.
and a lot of people will say the Phantom Menace was a horrible movie.
I loved it. It was good.
I loved the Phantom Menace, but and for a lot of people, the Phantom Menace was their first Star Wars experience in a movie theater.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
for the people
especially
that
our age
saw the
range.
yeah, the people that saw the original trilogies when they saw that first the Phantom Menace, they're like, that's not Star Wars. That's a pile of crap. But he was saying, as a kid, out of 14 years old, going to see the movie in the theater, coming out of it, there he's talking with my friend. It's like, oh my god, this is the best. This is really cool. I really love this. Really awesome. And the grown-ups that were behind us, so that you guys like that garbage. That movie was crap, and it's just
Oof.
Yeah.
and to have it explained from that point of view, I mean, like that how damaging that is to a kid's psyche, like how
Oh yes,
hurtful that is
absolutely.
to somebody who like, hey, I actually really like this, but I'm being told it's garbage. Why am I being told it's like my opinion is not valid, right?
It's true.
So
It's a terrible thing that I think fandom often slides into, especially when you get into the big boy fandoms that have ridiculously huge fan bases and have those like diametrically opposed sides, where like Star Wars and Star Trek, where the older fans make it like entrance into the fandom prohibitory as fuck. They get toxic as hell about things, being like, oh, it can only be this one way I'm already used to. And not only does that shoehorn the story from being allowed to go anywhere new or tell any interesting stories, but it also prevents new fans. And
Yeah, it does.
I think something they don't realize is without new fans, fandoms die. As much as we'd love to live forever, none of us will. And if the kids aren't interested in these things, they will die out with the current like generation that's obsessed with them. So to go in and hear a bunch of little kids, like Frank said, talk about, wow, this movie was so great. I'm so interested in this unique universe, to then be told by an adult who you're presumably going to, as a child, be like, oh, they must know more. They're older. Hear them go, oh no, that's shit. I can't believe you like that. That's such trash stuff. That's extremely fucked up as a mentality, because you're stopping those kids from like delving into the wonder that makes you care about it in the first place.
Actually, in relation to that, my brother-in-law's nephews, they're very into Star Wars, but they've never seen the original movies. Of course, they're quite young.
Hmm.
But they got into Star Wars through the Clone Wars series. Now, personally, I've never seen the Clone Wars series. I'm not very familiar with Star Wars in general. But I know that that was how they got into it. And further down the line, they started to learn more about this universe. They started to learn more about, oh, there are movies and things like that. And that is what's brilliant about having more branches of this universe. If you're going to keep saying, though, like, oh, only the first three movies are valid, or, the foundation of everything, yes, they may have started this whole thing. But that doesn't mean that they're the only source of entertainment that we can get from. They're not the only source of things that we can enjoy about this franchise.
I
The more
concur.
you make things about a franchise, the more accessible it will be to people, the more people will want to keep liking it.
And I think that's something that people really don't think about, is the longevity of fandom. Because like as little nerdlings ourselves growing up, the whole thing was being able to connect and communicate with other people who liked these things that weren't popular to like. And I think right now we're all lucky to be adults in the golden age of nerddom, where everything is made for us by us and it's great. And while that wasn't prevalent in past generations, as much as I love this now, it will end. Eventually, it will end. The MCU will stop being the popular kid on the block in terms of movies, because people who aren't actual nerds are going to get fatigued with superheroes, and then the actual nerds will stop being able to make the content. Star Wars is enduring because they release a trilogy of movies every goddamn 20 years and then go to sleep, except for like niche things like TV or web series or stuff like that, where the rest of the general public doesn't have to watch. And I think what people are forgetting is, if we don't let the younger generation get that wonder, get that interest, our fandoms will die. They'll die right here. And that'll be the end of that. Also, I never understood people who were like, oh, I love this thing so much. You're making more of it. Like, what?
Oh,
I'm
there.
giving you more of what you like.
yeah. But it's just like people that are blaming Kathleen Kennedy for ruining Star Wars, right? They're saying the last trilogy, they did a lot of missteps in that eighth movie where a director came in and he's like, this is Star Wars is here. This is my vision. I want to make my vision. I don't care about the rest. I don't care about the lore. I
Mm.
don't care about anything else. And he's
Mm.
actually said that in interviews. I don't care about Star Wars. I wanted to make my own version. I
Mm.
wanted to do this. This is my idea, and I didn't want to
Ooh,
compromise on it. So,
That's very
I mean,
dangerous.
that gives you an
that
idea
is
of the
so
type of person that
dangerous.
they brought in. Kathleen Kennedy, who's the president of Disney, Lucasfilms, and all that stuff, she's being
Oh,
blamed.
that's who she is.
She's being blamed for ruining Star Wars because of the last trilogy.
That seems
That's
very
not
unfair.
fair.
But she's the one that brought back Dave Filoni. She's the one that brought back Jon Favreau to make The Mandalorian. Season 1, 2, and 3 now. Ahsoka Tano,
Mm.
Obi-Wan Kenobi series. She brought
Our
those
Lord and
people in.
Savior Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Like, she brought those people in. But
Please.
Favreau and Filoni are getting credited for saving Star Wars.
Which
That's not fair.
you bring up an interesting dichotomy right there, because what is the chances are that she's getting shit on for being a female lead of a traditionally male-driven fandom?
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like, if you're blaming her for the fuck-ups, which, let's be fair, the last trilogy wasn't that great for new fans either. The movies are generally laughed at, and they're not that great.
They're not great
But
for new or returning fans. Seven gave
exactly.
us hope it should have never given us if 8 and 9 were what was around the corner.
If you blame her for the failures, you can't say, "Oh no, the success is not on her; it's on someone else." She still chose to bring those people in. That success, the coming back, is still attributed to her. You
Yeah,
Yeah.
can't say she failed. These people brought it back, but who hired those people? She did. So that kind of double faced. I don't know that she's only evil. If it wasn't for Dave Filoni, Star Wars would have failed. Well, she hired Dave Filoni, so you know.
I think that's a good point, actually. You touch on something really fucking painful about fandom culture that I wish we were. I mean, we're starting to move past it. It is getting there, but it's not. It's really not there yet. It's that double standard. Like, oh, well, these men fixed it, so the women's a villain. And you're like, no, no. She's hiring all of them. Yes, I will concede she made an extremely bad take by hiring a director who didn't give a shit about the art he was making. He just wanted to do his own thing. And auteur directors are fine. You want to do your own thing, that's cool. But don't join a pre existing thing if you want to do your own thing. Go fuck off to your
Yeah.
own thing, vibe in your corner, it's cool. But don't take something already existing, a collaborative effort, and then just piss all over it. That's disrespectful to the history of what you're joining. But, like, okay, I will say that was a bad take, hiring a director who do that. But then to be like, oh yeah, then she hired the people required to fix it, I would say that's in her capacity as a producer or as a CEO, that's what you do. You go, okay, that was the wrong choice. Let me go rectify that decision. She should be getting credit for having done that. Yes, Jon Favreau did fix things with The Mandalorian, which started the ball rolling of repairing the damage that 8 and 9 did to the franchise overall. But credit where credit is due. And I think that's a huge problem with nerddom, sliding back to the toxic fandom idea. I think we can branch right out of Star Wars and into something else with that too. Perfect example of that exact thing, Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones started off being very true to the books with a little bit of fiddling and a little bit of like auteur, and that happens in any adaptation. But all of a sudden, it just goes off the rails in season 5. Why? Because the directors said themselves, well, we got bored of telling George's story, we wanted to do our own story. And then when people got understandably upset about that, then they turned around and went, well, you know what, we're making a World War II drama after this, so we don't really care. And then you get things like season 8. How does Game of Thrones go from being the biggest TV show ever made in the history of humanity, the only thing to ever dethrone Sopranos in terms of universally accepted art, and then turn around to almost no one talks about this because everyone's ashamed of season 8. Like, there's something to be said about if you're going to, as a content creator, as a director, as a producer, writer, artist, whatever, if you're going to join a pre-existing fandom, if you don't want to be a part of that fandom, don't join it. Like, I understand,
Mm.
mechanically speaking, hey, it's a huge payday probably, and maybe it'll be some fun, but like, there's something to be said about the way legacy content is made. And if you're going to make legacy content, you have to be adding to that legacy. You can't be subtracting from it.
To branch into the books made into TV series, and gonna branch into one of my favorite fandoms, which is Lord of the Rings,
Mm,
which generally has been free of that kind of toxic fandom that we associate to the MCU or to we associate to Star Wars or to Star Trek.
that's true.
You don't really hear that many people gatekeeping Lord of the Rings or Tolkien and that stuff. And it's come to surface recently with
Mhm.
a new TV series that's coming out, The Rings of Power. I'm gonna argue that using racist comments doesn't make you a toxic fan. It just makes you racist. If your issue with the Lord of the Rings TV series is that they're casting a black person as a dwarf, you're not a Tolkien fan. You're a racist.
I definitely see what you're coming from. Like, people are hiding behind the idea, like, oh, it's just toxic fandom. Like, nah, dude, that's racist. Just saying shit with their chest. They got no business saying. But I do think that that is one of the aspects of toxic fandom. That weird threshold where you're like, oh, nerddom belongs to little geeky cis white men. You're like, no, that's ridiculous
Yeah,
as a thought process. Stop that
Oh
immediately. And
boy.
I think that's where that racism and other terrible things peak out. And I agree with you, Frank. I don't think that that is toxic fandom. I think that's just douchebags being that exactly, and then just having all the balls to say it with their chest inside of fandoms where their asses don't belong. The backlash of people about changing people's race has become a whole issue as a system. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with casting whoever is the best actor for the part, regardless of race and gender and all these things. But I do
absolutely.
think if it's part of the pre-existing story, stick to that just for the sake of accuracy of source material. However, with The Little Mermaid, the only thing they had to stick to was, is this a female presenting human? Yes, that's it. That's all. Goodbye.
Yeah,
Nothing else to do.
yeah,
Who
and then
cares what ethnicity she is? That was
yeah,
never part of the plot.
it's funny that they hide behind science. They're like, oh, well,
Mm-hmm.
there's not enough light below the water, so they can't develop the melatonin. Okay, first off,
That's insane.
mermaids aren't real, so science doesn't apply. It's a fantasy.
It's like,
Okay.
firstly, that's insane. I'd love to know the
Secondly,
person who, like, actually genuinely is like, oh yeah, no, I did the science. You're like, bro, there is no science.
There's
This
no
is
science
this
to
is the
apply
opposite
here.
of that.
there is no science. There's only racism.
Yeah, you're like,
Yeah.
dude, you are crazy, and you need to get
Like,
something up here checked if you think there's science behind the melatonin levels in a mer person. Like, what are you even
like,
saying?
or like the melatonin level in a dwarf that lives under a mountain. Who cares?
But
But
as in
like
fantasy dwarves,
fantasy
they are
dwarves
real.
are
Mm,
not real.
yeah,
You
exactly.
can do whatever you want. And I don't know how many times I've read a book about dwarves, and there's actually a book called Dwarves. I don't know if anybody's read it. It's a series, but
No.
it's actually really fun. So it's about a whole dwarven society,
Mhm.
and some of them definitely give up black energy or white energy or Asian energy. Like there's different clans within the dwarves. So why are they all white?
Yeah, I think that is a huge trapping in a lot of things. I think there is that terrible toxicity of gatekeeping that exists, and then people are like, oh, they can only be this ethnicity, they can only be this sexuality, they can only be this, that, and the other thing, and you're like, no, dude, this is a fantasy world. We can do whatever we want. But it's funny how that's like where the lines are, right? You can taste that it's racism fueled because you're like, oh, well, it's okay to be ignorant of the flavors of white because they're white. So they don't need to be specific. Whereas, God forbid you put like a colored dwarf in there because, oh no, it's the end of the fucking world. Very interesting example of that, sliding right back into Thrones, but like they actually did that in Thrones. And there's a perfect example of pretty much no one in the fandom giving a shit.
What example? I actually don't know.
So, early seasons of Thrones, back when Stannis, the Manus, is planning his army to go invade King's Landing, he sends his buddy Davos to go get the help of the Valyrian pirates. And he goes to that guy,
Oh yes.
Salador San. Well, Valyrians, the race Valyrians, it's like an ethnicity in that
Yeah.
world, are supposed to have Targaryen like features, be super pale, blonde, silver hair. It's not implicitly said that Valerians are all white, but they all have to be pale. So even if they are a person of color, they would have to be paler than most people of that ethnicity normally are, because they're supposed to be kind of like an albinoism thing going on. So they have to be like the albino-y version of whatever ethnicity. They still have ethnicities, though. Valerians are originally from Essos, which is, I guess, where you would have all of your people of color, normally speaking. So in the show, Salador San is cast by a very, very black man's, and it's fine. And nobody questioned it. Nobody said a goddamn thing. And I am a huge ass Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire nerd. I was in the fandoms, I'm in the YouTube videos, I'm in the comments, in the forums, lurking. I'm spending an obnoxious amount of time with Game of Thrones. And nobody was really complaining. A couple of people were like, oh, he doesn't look super Valyrian, but it wasn't like a prevailingly toxic thing. They were just like, Was this a good casting choice? I don't know, but whatever. The guy did fine. He captured the spirit of the character very well. He was very piratey. He gave off very good pirate energy. But with that said, it's obviously can be done. It was done in Game of Thrones. And now with the sister show that's going to be coming out this year at some point, House of the Dragon, House Velaryon is literally being portrayed almost entirely by people of color, if not entirely by, I can only go off the trailers, the show's not actually out yet, people of color, which they are also a Valyrian household, which would also presumably have this albinism trait that is like a race trait in Game of Thrones. Nobody's complaining, nobody's saying anything, there's a huge amount of black excellence on display, and they still gave them the silver blonde hair, so clearly it can be done in universe perfectly and without conflict. So I think it's really proof that the toxicity around having people of color in your fantasy things comes from toxic fandom, comes from racists loose with their mouths, and not people making fantasy content, because obviously it's cool for them to be there. It's not a fucking problem.
Actually, I have a very good example of this specifically. This is the fandom of Avatar: The Last Airbender. So, in the follow-up series, Legend of Korra, we do get a shot of the world, so the planet in space, like a very quick shot as a sort of sprinkling of...
Bit of flavor.
Now, from what we see of the show is basically populated entirely by people of color, mainly people that resemble East Asians, but you have people that look more Indian, more Southeast Asian, etc., etc. So for the longest time, that's what people accepted about the universe. This is just how it was. Once we got a shot of the world, there were people who called themselves fans, were like, oh, will we now be able to see the white people? And it's just like...
Ooh, that's a bad take.
I see where your racism is coming from now, because this is a fantasy world. Yes, the show is primarily based off of East Asian influences. The show creators said so themselves. They did a lot of research for the show, and I respect them for that. But if you're a fan, and if you say you're a fan, and then you're like, but where are the white people? That is your racism showing. This is not that world.
And either way, is there a problem not having like that many white people for once in a show?
I think if things weren't inherently like, oh, this is the default setting, here's this terrible message for everybody, here's the default setting, and everything else is fringe culture, then it wouldn't be problematic if somebody was like, hey, I feel like I'm not represented in this, when they're part of said default culture. Because you're like, yeah, you're right. You're in everything else.
Exactly.
It shows off less racism, but more white privilege energy.
Yes.
And it's not, I don't associate that. Maybe that's just my point of view as a hetero white male, because I'm the problem with society. But, that's what it is. I accept it. I'm everything wrong with society. Like, that's your privilege showing. Like, to expect to have something in a universe that's mainly Southeast Asian or even goes down to the water tribes, which are, I think, Antarctica equivalent.
Antarctica, they have a lot of Inuit influences.
The Northern Native vibe, exactly. So to expect to have a white character is more of a privilege because they're used to seeing it. They're used to getting that representation.
Yeah.
So they're expecting it more. Like
they're assuming that it should be there.
Where's my white character? And then so that's more of what I see it as.
Arguments like that are landing much more on privilege rather than like full-blown racism does feel just like racist light. You know what I mean? Like it's the gateway drug into racism. It's a microaggression, really. Yeah.
You're just on the line and you're like, am I gonna touch it? Am I not gonna touch it? I don't know.
It's like that fucking kids game. I'm not touching you. I'm not touching you. You're like, yeah, no, but you're still being a prick, aren't you? Like, you're still doing the fucking thing. I think you actually had a really good point there, Lynn. And that is exactly that. It's microaggressions. And when you stack those microaggressions up like that, you're going to result in having a full-on, aggressively racist point. And I think that happens too often in fandoms. But let's slide away from toxicity for a minute and actually talk about, well, I guess it's still kind of toxic, but talk about that weird duality that there is in the big boy fandoms. You ever notice that? Like, yeah, Thrones versus Lord of the Rings, and DC versus Marvel, and Star Trek versus Star Wars. In you guys' opinion, what do you think causes that it can only be one kind of vibe, because that's very prevalent in the big boy fandoms.
I think it's just historical. Like, oh, you like DC, well, you don't like Marvel. It's
Mm.
like, oh, you like this, well, then you can't like that. It's just preconceived ideas of what you should and shouldn't like. But fuck it, like there's always more than two things. It's just like gender. Fandom is fluid. You
I
can't
concur.
decide. You can't be like, oh no, I like Marvel, so I have to hate DC. No, sorry, that's not how it works.
Circling back to
Mm.
your whole idea of like the dichotomy in
Mm-hmm.
terms of fandom, I think one of the things is just a reflection of human nature of if it's not something I like, it is different. I do not like that.
Yeah.
It is the idea that there has to be a me versus them or an us versus them, which doesn't need to exist, but it's a very basic human default to say it's us versus them. We can't mesh. Like no.
Yeah, I think it is that. I think you hit the nail on the head with the word default, because it is that. It's a defective human trait that keeps getting repeated over and over
Yeah.
again, and I think that it might just be that getting accentuated. So before we let off Frank to go back into the wilds of his home, because it's locked down still and no one's allowed to leave. But before we let you go, Frank, what are, like, because we've been talking about negative things for a hot minute, so let's shift gears into some positive things. So, for you, what is something that you really, really like about any one of your favorite fandoms, and why do you feel that that's something fandom gives you that other areas of media don't necessarily scratch the itch of?
All right. So, I mean, for me, my favorite part of being in a fandom is easily the friends that you build within
Mm.
that society. So, for example, I'll take Star Wars because that's my go-to. I play a Star Wars mobile game called Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes. My favorite parts of being in that fandom is just that community that we've built around it. So, I've made friends that we've met through our Discord servers that we build, content creators that live in Arizona who I've talked to like in their DMs, and we've been like, hey, everything okay with your family and stuff like that. Like actually like legitimate friends. And the one thing that I keep like going back to is there's this one person that we met in this game, developed a friendship over a year of talking with him on Discord, and found out that he had terminal cancer in his lungs and his pretty much everywhere. Like he was going chemotherapy a week, pretty much. And so that's why his participation was not super the best. But like this guy had a free pass for pretty much anything because if he wasn't participating, it's because he was getting freaking cancer treatments, you know.
Yeah.
So like
Yeah.
you know what? No matter what, this guy like he's never getting the boot and like he's 100% safe. He was a huge Star Wars fan. He was a huge Old Republic fan. So for him, Jedi Knight Revan, that was his favorite character. That's who he wanted. Part of this game, it's a gacha game, so you want to collect your heroes.
Classic
When
mobile
when
vibes.
exactly, so when Jedi Knight Revan came out, first time that Revan came around, he didn't have the requirements, so he couldn't unlock it. Second time, didn't have the requirements, couldn't unlock him. So eventually, it took him, I think it was 6 months after the original release, to be able to unlock this. He unlocked him, geared him up to the maximum gear that he was able to take him at the time, which was gear 12. Next day, he passed away.
Oh.
That's
So
rough.
he was waiting for that. He wanted to get that done before he passed. I had made a bet at a time with one of the content creators. He was like, I'm gonna delete my channel if developers don't do this. I was like, well, listen, if they don't rework General Grievous, another iconic character in Star Wars Clone Wars, they need to rework Grievous. If they don't rework Grievous by this date, I'm deleting my channel. But I had made a bet with him. I said, if you delete your channel, I will get a General Grievous tattoo. So I went to see my friend who's a tattoo artist. We got the outline done and everything, and ran out of time, so I had to go back for a second session to go to the colors and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But in between those two sessions happening, my friend passed away, and his in-game name was Sinister. And one of the kits, one of the abilities in General Grievous's kit before the rework was called Sinister Laughter. So, under my General Grievous tattoo, I added the word sinister, kind of as an homage to this friend. So it's kind of a living memorial to him
That's
because
really cool.
he's a Jedi that General Grievous added to his collection. So that to me, that's what the positive things that these fandoms can bring out. That sense of like, hey, I have this new family that, the people that think the exact same way that I do, that we can exchange ideas. And so it's stuff like that, whether it's Tolkien, whether it's Marvel, whether it's DC, it's to be able to find a group of like-minded people that you can feel kinship to. And that's the positive things of fandom.
I concur.
Definitely. Oh yes.
That is the big power of fandom, and I think a lot of people get so caught up in the nitty gritty, or outsiders don't really get it, that they miss that point. That it's really that community. Because in our own little ways, all of us little nerdlings are other, or tossed into that category from young. So to find that unity, that community, that sense of found family that comes from fandom is profound. And for some of us, that can be life changingly profound and, help shape who we ultimately become and the biggest, most impactful experiences of our lives. So I think, yeah, that is a really positive, beautiful note to end off on. So I think we'll close out this guest segment right here. Thank you so much, Frank, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you, listeners, for joining us too for this episode of Needlessly Complicated Chaos. We have been a lot less chaotic this time, but I think it was very needfully complex. So I'll leave you guys off of there. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you guys.
Bye.
Needlessly Complicated Chaos is a TBP Creates production. Today's guest host has been Frank Brown, and your hosts have been Ace Donnie Rivas, Lynn Tao, and Sky Bernier Dion. Thanks for listening, gang.